It's not the best, but it does get the job done. We talk about treating in SCAB-E priority order because it's listed in terms of the immediacy of the life threat. Like everything we're teaching you, it's listed in immediacy of the life threat. So always remember, the first step is S. The first step is S for your situation. Is your situation as safe as you can make it? Much like what Douglas was just talking about. You shouldn't begin treatment if you're in immediate danger. And so what is immediate danger? One example would be you're in the office. It's a shooting situation. You can still hear shooting. The gunman is physically present. If at all possible, you want to try to move to a safer location. If you have a patient, try to move them to a safer location. And if not, move yourself to a safer location if you can. Another example of situation is we fight the worst first. We say that all the time. If you're in a fire, as Paul said, the smoke is going to incapacitate you before you can get to other things. So for you to survive and for you to help others survive, you're going to have to move. So situation is always first. Let's talk about a few things that you might need to figure out if you're working with. So like you need to know what your resources are. Some public buildings have TECC and AED equipment and supplies that are permanently stored in various areas. So knowing where these items are located, where we live and work is something that we should be practicing in everyday life. Practice it in advance of actually having an emergency. If your building doesn't have a TECC kit and you notice it, consider bringing in some supplies yourself or making a request that they be provided. When treating the injured, always look for these resources. So where can you find them? Well, you can communicate with other people at the scene who might be more familiar with it to establish where they can be found and what's available to you. You can look in hallways, office areas, cafeterias, nurses' stations, libraries, athletic areas, near elevators. Basically anywhere that people gather or ask for information is a good place to find them. TECC kits have bleeding control supplies such as bandages, gauze, tourniquets, chest seals, mylar. These are all things we're going to be talking with you about tonight. Accidents do happen every day, so know where these kits are and what they look like. All right, let's talk for a second about legal considerations. Oftentimes, Paul talked about how people often don't jump in. One of the reasons why that happens is people have concerns. They have concerns that they might get sued. They have concerns that they're going to do something wrong, and they're afraid. So we're training you tonight to try to get rid of the fear situation. The legal concern is something that you shouldn't let get in your way. It's a common worry and misconception, but you can't let it slow you down. Treating or moving a person whose life is in danger is better than doing nothing. An injured person in a fire is not going to escape the smoke. You can't possibly hurt them worse. You need to get them out of the smoke so that their other injuries can be treated. Now listen, there are Good Samaritan laws in all 50 states, the DC and US territories, and these laws are designed to protect people like us who are providing good faith assistance. As long as you're acting within the scope of your training, not outside of it, you should be okay. We're not training you how to do a tracheotomy. That's outside the scope of this class. It's way outside the scope of most of our skill sets. But as long as you stay within the scope of what you've been trained to do, you should be okay. So just remember that and don't be afraid to jump in. All right, SCAB-E, let's go back to SCAB-E order. The next step in SCAB-E care for the injured is to address any threats to circulation. That's C for circulation. Blood carries oxygen and nutrients to our cells, and it removes waste products like carbon dioxide. And when we lose blood, the whole process slows down. And our body reacts to this by restricting blood flow just to our essential organs, trying to keep us alive. But this is also the definition of shock. If we lose enough blood, even the essential organs aren't going to get enough to work, and we can enter a state of irreversible shock. How much blood do we have? An adult has about 5 or 6 liters of blood. That's roughly 5 or 6 quarts. An 80-pound child has about half of that. You might be wondering how much we can lose. Well, an average healthy adult can survive losing about half, as we see in this picture, as long as the bleeding is stopped and as long as there's rapid transport to medical care. But if we lose enough blood, we enter irreversible shock. And even with transfusions and surgery, there is no recovery from that. Arlington County is currently pioneering the practice of carrying blood on medical units. So that would allow the first unit of blood to be administered to a person actually in the ambulance before they get to the hospital. And it's things like that that will in future be saving lives. Every minute matters with severe blood loss. You can see on the slide, every second and every drop of blood counts. We know that shock is bad, and we know that uncontrolled bleeding can lead to irreversible shock, which is fatal. So how do we decide if there's enough blood loss to be worried about? Well, we don't. It's impossible for us as lay people to estimate how much blood a person's lost because blood goes everywhere and it's very difficult to determine volume. The best way to look at it is if you have a body reaction, a visceral immediate reaction of, oh my gosh, that's a lot of blood, treat it as serious bleeding. You know what you're seeing. If blood is flowing, don't worry about if it's spurting or not, just flowing, as opposed to dripping or oozing. This is serious bleeding. Look for how much blood is being lost, not how serious the injury looks. Again, the loss of blood fluid volume is the threat. You must focus on heavily bleeding wounds first. Now, if you'll note in this slide, we said ignore wounds that are not significantly bleeding except for amputations. And we're going to go into this a little more detail later when we talk about tourniquets. But whenever you see an amputation, whether it's partial or full, you're going to immediately put a tourniquet on. Okay? All right, let's keep going. Direct pressure. So your blood flows from your heart out to your extremities through blood vessels, which are like soft tubes and they run along your bones. When we want to stop life-threatening bleeding, we treat with direct pressure first because what we need to do is squeeze those blood vessels shut to stop. When we apply direct pressure, we're using our hands or even our knee to put body weight on the flesh surrounding that blood vessel. We're compressing it against the hard flesh, against the hard stuff that's inside, which is our bones. And we're squeezing those tubes inside shut to stop the blood flow through them and to stop us from losing that blood. Dr. Smith, Arlington County's medical director, has a great video where he talks a bit more about this, and we're going to return to the topic shortly. And as a reminder, if your video freezes, log off and log back into the session.
Pressure stops bleeding. It's one of those things.
Sorry, guys, let me try this again.
In medicine that we've known for a long time. It's one of the things that, it's a truth in medicine that's true today and it'll be true in 100 years. Pressure stops bleeding. So what we really want the citizen to do, how do you stop bleeding if you're on the side of the road or in the middle of the woods and waiting for someone to come help you is you have to put pressure on the bleeding. There's a couple things about that people need to understand. Number one, you got to understand a little bit about the anatomy. The major blood vessels, the ones that will cause bleeding to the point where you're going to die, are always deep under the skin near the bone. So they're always down, they run right along major bones. That means that you have to apply a lot of pressure. It's not just a little bit of pressure, it is a significant amount of pressure. Number two, it may cause some discomfort, and that's okay. You're not doing any damage, you're not hurting them, you're actually saving them. And number three, you have to hold it for a long time, right? You have to make sure you're holding pressure for long enough that the clotting process starts. How long is that pressure? As long as you can. It's until we get there. Until you can't hold it anymore. What people have a tendency to do is they want to come up and put a bandage on a bleeding wound. A bandage doesn't stop bleeding. All it does is soak up blood. And again, that blood that is soaking up into that bandage, it should be in your body. It shouldn't be being soaked into the bandage. We want it to stop. So before you put the bandage on, before you make something look pretty, you want to put pressure on it. That pressure is what works. If you don't get the bleeding stopped, even if you slow the bleeding, maybe you buy that person enough time until we can get there and completely control it. And then some bleeding can't be controlled. The wounds are too big. The artery is too large. The vein is too large. That's when we look at tourniquets, right? And even still, if you have a wound that needs a tourniquet, I want to put pressure on it while I'm getting the tourniquet in place. Because if you're free-flowing blood while I'm working on getting my tourniquet, you're dying while I'm getting my tourniquet in place. We want to stop the dying. We stop the dying by stopping bleeding with pressure, and then we apply the tourniquet, which then further controls it. That's the key.
All right, so let's talk a little more about direct pressure. Like Dr. Smith said, if you apply pressure to a wound and the bleeding stops, that's great. Even if it's going from fast to slow, you're still winning. Keep holding that direct pressure. If bleeding doesn't stop after you've held direct pressure for a few minutes, and if it's serious bleeding or serious wound, it probably won't, then we need to move closer to the heart and squeeze the blood vessel shut there. Anatomic pressure point is just a fancy way of saying that there are places where blood vessels are relatively close to the surface. There are ones in the arm just below the shoulder, and there's one in the crease between the groin and the upper leg. And if you put pressure there, you can pretty much shut the blood off to that extremity. So for instance, the femoral artery runs close to the surface at the top of each leg, sort of like if you went to the right or the left of the top of the zipper on a pair of pants. And if you don't wear pants with zippers, it's sort of midway in the crease. If you kneel on this, you can actually shut blood flow off to the leg. And we mentioned your knee before, and it bears mentioning again. You don't have to use your hand. Your knee can work great. It can allow you to use body weight, which is an advantage, and it allows you to keep your hands free for wound care or for calling 911. If you're working on the neck, you can apply direct pressure with one hand as long as it's on only one side. For the upper torso, our bones are nice and shallow. You can feel your ribs, but the blood vessels themselves are deep. So that's an area that we can't squash our blood vessel against the bone. So that's a tougher area for us to treat, which is why we talk about extremities. All right, direct pressure first. So if there's major bleeding and you've applied direct pressure, it's time to think about your next step. So there are a couple of options. We see them here. The first one is a tourniquet, and the second one is wound packing, and Sue's going to be covering that later. Tourniquets used to get a bad rap. The very early tourniquet was a braided rope, and while it did stop bleeding, it had some major drawbacks. A braided rope killed nerves, and it seriously damaged tissue. So at some point, a change was made to go to a narrow cloth strap, which was as effective and didn't cause as much nerve damage, but there were still some problems until we arrive at our modern tourniquet, which is 1.5 inches to 2 inches wide. It's a flat strap, and it seems to be the sweet spot. It seems to work very well. We have a lot of data that stems from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it shows that modern tourniquets can remain applied. We say up to 2 hours without causing additional injury, but actually they've been on for much longer than that. So that's kind of a minimum. People my age, we might have heard the whole, if you put on a tourniquet, you might save a life, but you're going to lose a limb. And that's just not true anymore. Our modern tourniquets work really, really well. So you have to disabuse yourself of that idea. If you need to use a tourniquet, not only do you need to use it, but you need to move swiftly to use one when it is needed. Okay, so how do tourniquets work? Well, they are compressing the tissue of the limb, like we talked about, stopping the blood flow through the vessels inside. So in other words, tourniquets are a strap, and it grabs the soft stuff and it squeezes it against the hard stuff, the bones. It's mechanical direct pressure, and it does it all around the limb. We're using a mechanical advantage. What is that tourniquet made of? It's a strap, at least 1.5 inches wide, like we said, and a buckle, and some kind of mechanical lever or crank or ratchet to really crank up that pressure around the limb. When do you use one? Well, you're going to always use one on an arm or a leg wound with massive bleeding. Sometimes, though, like I said before, really terrible injuries like an amputation don't bleed much at first. That's because in the initial panic, the artery will contract and retract, and that will cut off blood, but that's very temporary. Once that wears off, the artery will relax and blood will start coming out. So if you see someone who's lost a limb, apply a tourniquet now, because once things relax, it can be very difficult to get that bleeding under control. A lot of blood can be lost before you do. So when you do apply a tourniquet, always pull it tight, as tightly as you can before you crank down. And we're going to show you a couple examples of how to do that when we go through demos, and we'll talk about it when we talk about tourniquets. And when you do tighten it, you are going to tighten it as much as you can until the bleeding stops or until you can't tighten it anymore. You're looking for blood to stop flowing. If the blood doesn't completely stop and you have a second tourniquet, like it says on the slide, you can use that second tourniquet, you apply it right next to the first one. And that's because both tourniquets are actually working on the same tissue, When you put them next to each other, they function like one big tourniquet, and that works better than two separated from each other. Some people are just naturally going to need a couple tourniquets or big, super wide tourniquet, and that's people who are just larger in size or very athletic, have a lot of muscle mass. So if you need it, do it. You can even use 3 if you need to, if you have it. And then finally, because as people move, sometimes their muscles can change position and some blood can get past that pressure. Or if people are being moved, they can get jostled. Sometimes that can loosen up the pressure on a tourniquet. You always want to check back for renewed bleeding. That's super important. And we're going to emphasize it a number of times tonight. Check on bleeding over and over again. All right, so tourniquets, once you know how to use them, they're fast and easy to apply. In our CERT classes, people who have never seen one before would probably take about 30 seconds to do the first one, and then with a little practice, they could do it in half that. If a tourniquet is needed, the sooner you apply it, the better the outcome is likely to be. So don't hesitate to use it. If you think you should use one, use one. As Dr. Smith said, tourniquets do hurt. That's a point that you'd be aware of. If we're in an in-person class, you'll have a chance to feel that pressure, and it is uncomfortable. But keep in mind through all of this that you're saving a life, and that's so much better than the alternative of not doing that. Where do we put tourniquets? We put tourniquets in 4 places only. We're only putting tourniquets on extremities, and we're only putting them in these positions that you can see. We've marked them with black bars here on this picture. So high and tight on each extremity. Now, some first aid classes will tell you to apply it right by the injury. That might be appropriate in a single situation, but because we're talking about situations where there might be massive injuries and injuries that you can't see, we do not teach you to do this. If there's heavy bleeding, it's hard to recheck for other injuries, and shutting the whole limb down is unlikely to cause additional problems, but you might actually also stop bleeding in injuries that you don't see. So you can see on the picture, place the tourniquet high on the arm across the top of the bicep, as far up on the arm as you can place it, and still keep it horizontal or square to the arm as you place it, okay? It should not ever be at an angle on the arm. Never place a tourniquet over a joint, okay? Straight across there, as high up as you can work it. On the leg, you can apply it as high up on the leg as you can work it. You work it up as high as you can on the inside, and the strap will be slightly angled, can be slightly angled toward the outside. So it can kind of bite into that haunch a little bit. Never place a tourniquet directly over a joint, ever. Talked about that before. Another thing to keep in mind, that you want to check for things in pockets. If you put a tourniquet over keys in a pocket, you're actually going to cause another injury. If you're putting a tourniquet over a cell phone in a pocket, your pressure is not going to work, or you'll have uneven pressure. So check pockets and empty them. And we already talked about using them side by side. All right, so let's take a look at some examples of tourniquets. This is the SAM XT tourniquet. This was the winner of Dr. Smith's Arlington focus group of citizens because people liked the feedback of the teeth clicking into place. And that is what happens when you pull the strap tight and it tells you that the tourniquet is set. It makes an audible sound. In CERT classes, students can learn this quickly and they can apply it in 15 seconds. And we're going to go over this in hands-on practice. We have one scheduled for September. Everyone in this class is welcome to come to the hands-on practice, but we'll also demo it tonight. Pieces you can see we talked about have every tourniquet has a strap. It has a buckle that the strap goes through. It has a windlass, which is that bar. And then it also has a catchment device where the bar is resting that keeps the windlass from unwinding after all that pressure's on it. So SAM XTs, just we need to note they may be a little less effective on a small limb, like a child's limb, or a very large limb. It also would be less effective if someone has bulky clothes on. All tourniquets are always much more effective against skin or very light clothing, like a light layer. In a real world emergency, always put it on bare skin if you can. It's not always possible, but do it if you can. And finally, once you apply a tourniquet, you always want to tack down any loose parts or loose ends so they don't get caught on something and loosen the tourniquet. And we'll show you how to do that when we do a demo. This is the combat application tourniquet, otherwise known as a CAT. This is the most common one in use. I really like this one, especially for folks, younger folks or folks who are having hand strength issues, because the Velcro is really great for getting that tourniquet set. It also has a strap, a buckle, a windlass, and a windlass capture mechanism, like we talked about earlier. And it's important on this one that all the slack be taken up before beginning to operate that windlass. A rule of thumb is you should never be able to fit 2 fingers underneath a strap before tightening it. And if you can, you need to remove any of that extra slack before you start tightening down. And the CAT's easy to use, just like the SAM-XT. All right, so let's take a minute and let's demo these. And then after that, we'll talk about a few more tourniquets that you might see. Let's see, let's start with the SAM-XT. Janine, would you mind telling me, can everybody see me okay? Can you see me in the frame all right?
I am working on spotlighting you right now.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully I'm in there. This is this.
Can you unpin your screen? Is that, for some reason?
Oh, let me do this. Let me do this. I'll just have to relaunch. So, can everybody see me?
No.
No.
How about now?
No.
Yes.
Yes. Getting there. Okay.
Did that work? Okay.
Yes, could see you before too.
Thanks for your patience, everyone. Okay, so this is a SAM-XT. This is the buckle. You can see that here. This is the windlass capture area, and I put that over it to secure the windlass. This is the windlass, okay? And this is the strap.
Only getting your initials.
Pardon?
I'm only getting your initials.
On
the screen.
okay. Is that what everybody else is seeing? Just my initials?
Click on her picture.
I see you perfectly.
Well, I'll give it a minute. It's okay to keep talking. So, so a lot of times people think this is like a seat belt, but it's not. You have an opening here. You can see on the SAM-XT, and that's where the strap fits through. So we're actually going to put the strap through that opening, and that's how you assemble the tourniquet. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to put my arm through. I'll do a couple things here. I'm going to open this up. This is where I'm going to put my windlass when I'm done. All right, I like to orient the windlass toward the outside of the body, as you can see, because as I move, I'm more likely to jostle it if the windlass is on the inside of my body. All right, now with the SAM-XT, I need to set it. So if we're all I'm gonna be quiet and I'm gonna set it, and hopefully you all will be able to hear the click, okay? You ready? Did you hear it? That's the sound of the tourniquet being set. You want that to happen before you start tightening. All right, so here we are with the ratchet. To stop bleeding, you're gonna turn this ratchet over and over and over and over again. You're gonna turn it until you can't turn it anymore and until bleeding has stopped. It may be 2 or 3 turns. Now, for the interest of saving my my tourniquet here, I'm not going to do that. I just made 1 turn. Once I've done that, I'm going to secure it in the catchment device. I'm going to put this little wrap over it, which is designed to help keep it there, but also you can write the time that you applied the tourniquet. Now, this is Velcro, and Velcro helps secure things too. So when I'm done, I'm going to secure the tail by wrapping the Velcro around and sticking it to itself. Okay? All right. Yes.
I'm still only getting the CS. I'm using an iPhone. I'm not using a computer. Is that making the difference? I don't see you at all.
I think that's making the difference. If anybody knows how to help, please speak up while I get ready with the second tourniquets. I'm not sure what the solution is for this situation. So if anyone does know, if you're calling.
Anyone else using an iPhone?
Yes.
How did you get her picture on your iPhone? I don't hear anybody.
All right. I'm so sorry that's not working. But we will have this.
Recommend, Catherine. there's one thing that I can recommend to her while you set up is that if she can see your video, if she can find Catherine in her screen, next to you, next to your name, Catherine Sprite, there's gonna be 3 spots, 3 dots. If she clicks on the 3 dots and select the spotlight, from there, she should be able to make you bigger. She can try
It
that.
doesn't say spotlight on after my 3 blocks. It doesn't say spotlight.
All right.
Does it have the option of large gallery preview?
Oh, wait a minute. Something happened. There.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you.
job troubleshooting everyone. All right. So we're going to move on. Thanks for all the assist, you guys. This is a cat. And like I said, with the cat, it's very helpful because it's basically the strap. It's one side strap, the second side is Velcro. So if you're looking at getting a tourniquet and you have hand strength issues, this is a great one to think about. Again, you have a strap, you have a attachment device where you put the windlass, you have a buckle. And again, the hole in the buckle is where the strap goes through. So you poke it through like that. All right. You put the tourniquet on. And in this case, guys, remember, and this tourniquet is like so many other tourniquets that aren't the SAM-XT, you have to tighten it as tight as you can before you start turning the windlass. The way that you do it with a cat is you tighten it and then you tack the Velcro down all the way around until you get to the windlass, but not over the windlass. Then you can tighten the windlass, and again, you tighten it and you tighten it and you turn it and you turn it and you turn it till you can't turn it anymore until the bleeding is stopped. And then you secure it with this, and you can put the time on it. And again, as with all tails, you always want to wrap the tail around, secure it so that it doesn't come loose. Okay. All right. So let me get myself situated here. And we'll briefly talk about a few other types of tourniquets. But guys,
did you say that this could only be used once?
Generally, it's good to have one tourniquet to practice with and another one to use in emergencies. So,
once you've tightened it, it's not. You can still use it again, correct?
It starts to loosen, right? If you tighten it enough to stop bleeding, you would never use it again. First, because there's going to be blood all over it, but also because it will have stretched.
But for practice purposes, that's not.
For practice, it's okay. Mainly, you just want your hands sort of being able to assemble it and put it on, tighten it. Yeah.
Ignore my comment then in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. Can everybody see the slide again? Okay. So here are a few other tourniquets you might see. The soft T over there has triangles to secure things in, and it has a little clasp instead of a buckle. The military emergency tourniquet, you can see that the strap is actually pulled through the windlass, so that's a little different. You actually have to hold it tight and secure it tight while you're turning. And then the ratcheting tourniquet, it's almost like a ski boot. So once you've set it, you need to pull that ratchet, click it up and down to tighten it. And all of these tourniquets work. They're all commercial tourniquets. Different groups use different ones or prefer different ones, but a tourniquet is great. All tourniquets can work if they're commercial and you know how to use it. If you sign up for our in-person class, guys, we'll give you an opportunity to try out a lot of different types of tourniquets, not just the ones that I demoed for you, but these different ones that you might have in a TECC kit that you're not familiar with. You have a chance to get your hands onto them. And I think Janine is going to post the link for us. Let me have a sip here. All right. Improvised tourniquets are going to be reviewed in the hands-on class as well. It's important for you to understand how to make one if you need to, but it's the very same principle. You need something you can use as a strap, something you can use as a windlass, and something you can use to fasten it all down. If you're folding something to be your strap, you're going to fold it to be about 2 inches wide. We don't just roll it up because rolled up cloth, again, becomes too narrow. We don't use a rope or a shoelace or anything skinny like that because, as we talked about, that can cut through flesh with the amount of pressure that we're putting on it. On TV, you might see people using belts, and it seems like they might be ideal, but now you know enough to know that they aren't flexible enough. You can't tie a knot in one, you can't twist one tighter and tighter, so you want to avoid using that. You can use it to secure things down, but you don't want to use it for your main strap. Avoid stretchy fabrics because they'll stretch. You want something that won't stretch, it'll get tighter. Use cotton or denim. A shirt sleeve is great as long as it's not stretchy. Use something solid as your windlass so it won't break. So one pencil won't work, but a bunch of them together might. And you can be creative. It can be practically anything: a stapler, a ruler, a utensil, some chopsticks, anything that you can find. You will need to secure it all down like we did with the tails. So when you're done turning your improvised windlass, if you have leftover tails, you can use them. You can use that string now, electrical cord, another piece of cloth, pretty much anything else. Once you've turned the windlass enough to stop bleeding, your main goal after that is to keep the windlass from unwinding again, because remember, it's under a lot of pressure to unwind. So the goal is to tie everything down so securely that the tourniquet can't loosen itself and your windlass can't unwind. We're going to teach you some techniques for doing this in the hands-on class. Just like with store-bought tourniquets, again, if the bleeding hasn't stopped, you might need 2, you might even need 3, put them next to each other. So next we're going to watch a short video of a crackerjack medic who's going to show you an application of an improvised tourniquet. But one thing I do want you to note is this crackerjack medic is talking to you to give you skills with the idea that you're going immediately to a medical facility. So we do teach you things a little differently than what we do in the video. So pay attention and see if you can catch those little differences that we've taught you tonight from what goes on in the video. All right. If your video freezes, just keep in mind you can log out and log back in.
So on this channel in the past, we've talked about a couple pieces of medical equipment a lot, and those are tourniquets, chest seals, packing gauze, and splints. And today on the channel, I want to show you guys how to improvise this. If you don't have a commercial device out there, these are some techniques you can use to accomplish the same objective. I would like to point out that this should never be your plan A. Anybody that carries a strip of cloth in their first aid kit and a little stick saying, well, I'm just going to do a makeshift tourniquet, I would not recommend that at all. In the Boston bombing, there were a lot of makeshift tourniquets applied, and what they found is that a vast majority of them were ineffective. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the problem with a tourniquet that's not 100% effective? And I'll tell you, so if you have a tourniquet that is not completely tight, is not occluding blood flow 100%, all you're actually doing is occluding the vascular return in the leg, not the arterial discharge. So you will still have bleeding from the artery, but now you've stopped any vascular return into the body, so they're not getting any of that blood back. And you can actually speed up blood loss. So it's really important that if you use this technique, you do it right. The same thing goes for chest seals. Chest seals are actually pretty easy to make, but they take a lot of time. So all of these things I'm showing you, you should practice. You should make sure you're proficient in them if you foresee a situation where you might have to do it. Having this knowledge is something that's good, but you have to understand that there are limitations to it, and plan A should always be a commercial device because, quite frankly, they're more effective and they're quicker to apply. So let's start with tourniquets. So to make a makeshift tourniquet, you just need 3 things. And right here, I have a cravat, which is a triangular bandage. It doesn't have to be this. It can be any kind of fabric, and you're gonna need 2 strips. So this is just a cut up t-shirt that I'm gonna be using. And then you need something to act as a windlass. So I'm gonna be using my X shears for this. However, this can be anything. This can be a stick, it can be a piece of silverware, what have you. It just needs to be something that can have a lot of force exerted on it and not break. So to make a makeshift tourniquet, the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna take your main, most sturdy piece of cloth, and you're gonna make sure it's pretty wide. You want this cloth kind of as wide as you can get it and put it over the arm or the leg that's bleeding. So you want it above the injury. So they're saying 2 to 3 inches above the injury site, just not over a joint. You're gonna wrap it around the leg and you're gonna tie just an over-under knot right across the leg. We're gonna do it on the leg for this scenario. Then you're gonna put your makeshift windlass inside that. You're gonna tie another knot on top of that and potentially a second one depending on how well that fabric's holding. Then you're gonna take your makeshift windlass and you're just gonna start turning it. It's the same concept as a soft key wide or another windlass tourniquet that you can buy commercially. You're gonna turn that until blood flow stops. At that point, you need to hold that windlass right there. You're gonna take the second piece of cloth and put it across and feed it through that windlass. And what that's doing is that's keeping it from turning back and loosening all the way. Once you have that secure, make sure that all the blood flow is stopped. If it hasn't stopped completely, try tightening the windlass 1 or 2 more turns. If that's not working, prepare to put a second tourniquet on there.
Okay, guys, before we moved on, let's see if you all caught a couple of things in the video that are different from what we've taught you tonight. Did anyone catch them? If you noticed anything, please post an answer in chat.
I don't know how to chat, but he said one step.
Too low.
One.
Too low on his leg.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So again, we teach you to go as high as you can on the extremity. So because you can't always see all the wounds, you know you have one heavily bleeding wound, but sometimes there are more. And so there's no harm in going all the way to the top. High and tight is what we teach you. So well done, guys. Anything else?
Maybe too wide a fabric.
Starting with wide fabric is really important because that way it doesn't rope, it doesn't have that roping effect, which can cut into flesh or possibly hurt nerves. So starting wide is the right idea. It did look a little over wide, but as he tightens it, it's gonna tighten up a little bit. It's a good observation. I like the way you're thinking about it. Anybody notice anything when he tied it down? Tied the windlass down?
It got looser.
It did. It did. So again, wonderful observation there. It's tough when you're demoing, you know, it's so easy to have things get away from you a little bit, but it loosened. And if the whole point, again, is to keep that windlass from loosening, if you're going to have an improvised tourniquet and you stop bleeding, you can't have it loosen even a little bit because that might be just enough for blood to get past that pressure. So great observation, you guys. Thanks. You're obviously following everything we're teaching tonight, and I really do appreciate that. So again, tighten it as much as possible, tie it down without loosening the tourniquet. Mistakes, you know, little mistakes can be made, but everything gets better with practice. So I really just want to encourage you guys to get your hands on some tourniquets and practice with them. It's so much easier to do them once you've got a little practice under your belt. So let's look at the other mistakes that we need to look at. So we want to avoid waiting too long to apply them. We want to avoid not tightening enough before we start ratcheting the pressure down. We want to put it up high. We don't want it to ever loosen after application. In fact, you will never take a tourniquet off yourself. It is never to be loosened by you. This is only to be done in a hospital setting by a doctor or other medical personnel. Once it's on there, it is on there. Forgetting to reassess. We talked about this before, but you have to recheck because bleeding can start again. And that can be deadly, so don't forget to recheck. And then don't get a knockoff tourniquet. We showed you some ones that'll work, good commercial tourniquets. It is very difficult to be sure that you have a tourniquet unless that is not a knockoff, unless you are going directly to the manufacturer of the tourniquet or to a medical supply source. A lot of times they're advertised as tourniquets, but they don't work reliably as one. So a lot of research goes into these things. So go to a reliable supplier, and you're looking at probably a good price is $30, $35 for a tourniquet. Okay, so I'm going to hand the mic to Sue now, who is going to move on with our second potential intervention, which is wound packing. Sue?
Okay, great, Catherine. Just to recap, let's look at the big picture. When we're faced with life-threatening bleeding, what's the first thing we do? By now, we should all know we always use direct pressure on the wound. You can use your hand, your knee, your body weight, and apply as much pressure as you can to the wound. And remember, the reason we talk about body weight is you have to hold it for a long time, and it gets very exhausting. And don't worry about being too hard on it. If there's heavy bleeding in the extremities, that's the arms or the legs, use a tourniquet if you have it. That's the first thing to do, especially on the arms and the legs. Remember, we apply it high and tight. It's fast, and once again, if you practice, you can do it in less than 30 seconds. But let's say you don't have a tourniquet, either a commercial or improvised. We talk about wound packing, and that's another option for controlling bleeding from a deep wound, especially if there's a gash or a big piece of flesh missing. The idea is to fill up the wound with gauze to replace the missing flesh, and then we apply direct pressure to it to do bleeding control. It's effective, but it takes longer than a tourniquet. That's why it's not our first option. We're going to talk about wound packing using regular gauze and then with hemostatic gauze, which basically has a chemical on it to promote clotting. But before we let's do that, let's talk about the anatomical areas where you can use wound packing. Okay. The highlighted green areas on the body are appropriate for wound packing. Wound packing is effective for both the arms and the legs, both the front and the back. Okay? Wound packing is also effective in the junctional areas. Those are the areas where the limbs attach to the body, okay, where you can't use a tourniquet, such as the groin, where the femoral artery runs close to the surface. It's also good on the buttocks, the shoulder, the armpit, and the very base of the neck. In these areas, you can't effectively wrap a pressure dressing, so we use wound packing and direct pressure. And certainly, if you have the hemostatic agent, please use it, okay? Wound packing generally is not effective in injuries that have perforated the chest, like a gunshot wound or something like that, stab wound to the chest, the abdomen, or the back. The cavities are basically just too large, you couldn't fill them, and the blood vessels are just too deep and buried in the body, so direct pressure is just not going to work. Although it's not highlighted here, the head and the front of the neck also are not good areas for wound packing. We're going to have to use direct pressure because we've got to be careful. We don't want to compromise somebody's airway.
Can I ask if anybody has their mic on or their camera on? If you don't mind turning it off, we'll have a little less interference, and I really appreciate your understanding. Sorry for the interruption, Sue.
No problem. Okay. Okay, look first. We need the next picture, okay? Next slide. If you look first at the bottom picture with the X, and it shows that there's a deep gaping wound. Direct pressure on the surface might not stop the bleed because the pressure is not effectively reaching the injured blood vessel. It's way down deep. Because of the missing flesh or space, the bleeding just continues to fill the space, and putting pressure on the top doesn't work. But if you notice the top picture, it shows that if you completely fill that void with tightly packed gauze and then apply direct pressure, it will translate the pressure right onto the blood vessel and stop the bleeding. So basically, it's a cotton plug that we're using to apply direct pressure to the vessel. Gauze is great because it promotes clotting. And let me just hold this up. This is some gauze, and let me see. It's got I don't know if you can see that. You see it because the open weave gives platelets something to cling to. But if you have the hemostatic gauze, that's even better because it's coated with a chemical called kaolin or chitosan, and it promotes coagulation and clotting. And you can see examples of that on the slide. We're teaching you not only the uses right now, but the thought process, because you're getting a lot of information right now, and in everyday emergency, you have to make a decision on what you're going to do. If you have a gauze available to you and the wound is in a junctional area, for wound packing, use it. But in a multiple casualty event, you may not have enough of that, especially the hemostatic gauze, because it tends to be expensive and we don't always carry as much of that. So you might want to save that for the junctional areas. Okay. Warning, we're now going to show you some bloody pictures with a large wound in the next slide. So hopefully you're prepared for that. Okay. Basically, this is a picture of a very deep bleeding wound. It's a gash, and it's a good candidate for packing. Basically, it looks like the bicep has been cut with a knife, okay? The idea we're going to do is we're going to fill up the void with tightly packed gauze and then apply sustained pressure from the top, like we saw in the last picture. And we're going to go over that step by step. Step number one is pretty obvious. First, you got to be able to see the injury, so you got to get rid of the clothing, rip off the clothing. Don't worry about cutting it or being neat, just get rid of it, okay? If possible, what we want to do is we want to remove the loose clots. it's most, wound packing is most effective if you scoop out the coagulated or congealed blood before packing. Blood congeals and it turns into a jelly-like substance when exposed to air, and that can cushion the packing and pressure and defeat your purposes. So what we're asking you to do, something probably the grossest thing we'd ask you to do, is to actually remove that with your fingers and scoop it out, okay? And if you're helping to keep someone alive, remember, even though it's gross, it'd be amazing how well you'd be able to handle something like that. And when you do this, be super careful. Remember, we don't know what caused that. There may be a broken bone in there, and there may be fragments of metal, glass, or something else like that. So what I want you to do is I want you to wrap your finger with gauze before you're actually sticking it in to there to feel around. When you reach into the wound, you may be able to see or even feel where the bleeding has come from. It may feel like a wiggle or a pulse. Put your finger firmly and directly on that to stop it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wound pack and keep pushing all your wound packing into that particular place. Okay? Next, what we're going to start to do is we're going to start packing the gauze. Push it in firmly. Try to fill every single millimeter. And I'm going to demonstrate that in just a minute. The main thing to remember is don't be timid or shy, be bold, and do not stop short of packing every available space. Any empty space is going to defeat your purpose because it's going to let the blood continue to run. Another key point is gauze is best, but if you don't have it, let's say I don't carry it in my, a backpack or my purse or whatever, you can use anything that's cotton, preferably not synthetic, because cotton also has the holes in it, will help with the coagulation. Don't worry about it being sterile. You can use a dirty sock or whatever. Once you've saved somebody's life from the direct threat of bleeding, then we can worry about antibiotics once they get to the hospital. Okay? The next thing you're going to do is you're going to firmly press the gauze into the wound and hold the pressure for 5 to 10 minutes if it's plain gauze. Okay? That's a long, long time. If you have the hemostatic gauze, it'll probably only take about 3 to 5 minutes. And once again, we're stopping the bleeding. Okay. After the allotted time, okay, we've done that 5 to 10 minutes, which seems forever, especially in an emergency. You gradually release the pressure and see if it's still bleeding. We're not going to lift things off. We're not going to take the gauze out. We're going to leave it. But if it's still bleeding, then you just hold it for another 2 to 3 minutes, okay? Once the bleeding has stopped, we're going to then wrap it with a pressure bandage because, okay, here we have it, but we can't sit and hold this the whole time. So we're going to teach you in a couple of seconds how to use a pressure bandage to hold it in place until help arrives. Okay? But first I'm going to demo the packing on a fake injured limb. Okay? Now, here is my leg. Pretend that I'm really athletic and I can get my leg all the way up here. Okay? I don't know if, can people see me now?
We can see you.
Okay, fine. What you're going to do is you're going to, first of all, if it's, imagine the leg has got the hole and it's bleeding a lot. So you know there's a deep problem. There's some injury inside. If it's not bleeding a lot, you don't have to worry about it. Use just a little direct pressure. Okay. But first what we're going to do, we're going to have to expose it. So whatever clothes, pants, or whatever, we're going to have to get rid of that. Tear away the clothing. Then you're going to get your gauze ready. And one neat trick is to throw the gauze over your shoulder, okay? Because that way we can feed it in a whole lot easier. And now what we're going to do is we're going to carefully insert our finger. Remember, it's wrapped, because I want to be careful that there's nothing sharp in there that's going to hurt me and create a new injury. And I'm going to carefully insert my finger in for the location of the bleed and scoop out all that gross stuff. Okay? Then what we're going to do, now that we know where the bleed is, we're going to just start packing. And we're going to just keep packing as much as we can to that particular bleed, where that blood vessel is. And you just keep doing it till you can't get any more in there. Okay? Well, I can't get any more in there. Then I'm just going to take everything that's left, I'm going to wrap it all together, put it in a thing, and I'm going to hold it there and put direct pressure on it. And I'm going to hold it. Preferably, I'm not going to sit with my arm like this. I'm going to put a knee on it or something else real hard to hold it. Because remember, it's going to be there for 5 to 10 minutes. If it's, we use the hemostatic agent, it may be done in 3 to 5 minutes. After that, I'm just going to kind of peek and see, is it still bleeding? Oh, it's still bleeding. I'm going to put my hand back. I'm going to put that pressure on for another 2 to 3 minutes. And once it's done, I'm then going to wrap it with a pressure dressing. Before we move on with pressure dressing, can people put in the chat how long we should hold the direct pressure after packing a wound? Any answers?
No answers yet.
3 to 5.
3 to 5 for the hemostatic agent.
Someone's saying 5 to 10.
Yes, that's right. 5 to 10 for the regular packing. And remember, you can use a dirty sock, you can use anything, preferably cotton. Once again, we use direct pressure first, then we use a tourniquet, commercial or improvised if we have it. Then we're going to use wound packing with some cotton or hemostatic gauze, but now we're going to apply a pressure bandage to that. And the pressure bandage uses an ACE bandage. You know what an ACE bandage is? You remember that? Something stretchy like this? It's not the one that sticks to itself. It's more old-fashioned, that it retracts, because as we wrap it around, it's going to hold pressure on the wound itself. And what you do is once you do that, then you can do some other things. You can help some other people, or you that's going to work for you. The pressure bandages basically provide constant direct pressure to the wound. They're very effective, especially on arms or legs. They're less effective if the wound is not completely packed. That's what we're telling you. You really need to get all that stuff in there, okay? They're an alternate tourniquet for smaller limbs. If you've got a kid, a regular tourniquet's not going to work. Their limbs, their arms and legs are too thin. Let's say up to 3rd grade or so. So they can be more effective than a tourniquet in those cases. The reason we don't use it first is it takes 2 to 3 minutes to apply properly, okay? And if there's an immediate threat, you may not have time to be able to wrap. That's one of the issues. But keep in mind, because it takes longer, but we need to do it carefully and slowly, because if we do it fast, we're going to drop it and we're going to have to start all over again, okay, and mess it up. And when you do practice with us, you'll see it takes a lot of practice to be able to do that. Okay, there's a video, and once again, if there's, as a reminder, if it freezes, log off and log back in, okay?
My name is Randy White, and I'll be demonstrating the pressure dressing. Okay, the first thing is, of course, is BSI, to make sure that you have your gloves on. The next thing is you'll need some 4x4s, and as soon as you get there, you want to make sure that you cover that and put direct pressure, pinpoint pressure over that bleeding. Okay, once you've done that, you may need to move on to a different skill, like, for instance, airway or treating for shock or something like that. So I'm going to put a pressure dressing on it, okay? Now remember, once you put this on here, you shouldn't be looking at it anymore. I'm going to put an anchor wrap on, and an anchor wrap really is just to keep my bandage from slipping all over the place. And now I'm going to, again, keeping direct pressure over the top, I'm going to be moving the wrap distal to proximal, proximal to distal, okay? And as I'm going to make this look a little pretty, okay? Now when I want to do direct pressure over the site, okay? I'm going to bring the bandage around, and now I'm going to move the bandage over and put direct pressure over the site with that. I'm going to come around, being careful now not to drop my roller gauze, because if I do, then I've lost the ball game. And it's a lot easier to drop when you're rolling backwards. Now I'm rolling forwards again. I'm going to do this one more time. Here, and one more time here. Okay? Now I'm just going to finish it up. Making sure that we're slinging over the top. Again, tightening up it.
Okay, have you seen how he done it? First, one of the things we're going to do is you put some kind of gauze or something on the wound itself, okay? And then you start wrapping this around. But remember, what you're going to do is you're going to wrap and you're going to pull as we go around. It works better. You have to do it a little slower. It works better if it's folded this way and you just keep going around and around. At one point, we want to keep the full width of the bandage. We don't want it to rope, except when we go over the injury. Then I'm going to twist it, right? I'm going to twist it right over the injury. And then I'm going to go around one more time, and then I'm going to twist it in the other direction, right over the injury itself. Okay? And then I keep doing that. You want to do it slow and smooth, but each time remembering we're doing it fast. And then you recheck to see if it's still bleeding, okay? Once I'm done with the whole thing, you put your finger under the last wrap and then tuck it in. We don't use the clips, we don't use the Velcro that a lot of them come with. And it definitely is slower, but you need to do it slowly and smoothly. If I drop it, I'm going to have to wrap it up and start all over again because I'm going to lose all my pressure up here, okay? You'll get faster and faster with practice, but we all, the first time we do it, we all drop it a lot, okay? Now, we can use pressure bandages on junctional areas. We put pressure on them. The neck and the underarm wrap will hold the pressure on these areas. This is kind of a neat way of doing it, okay? But it is not, it's not nearly as tight, and it's on a junctional area. If you move your arm down, it's going to tighten it a little bit more. It can be used on the groin or the buttocks or any place, or swell around your hip, any place where you need to hold pressure. But it is clearly not nearly as tight as around a limb. Okay? Now, remember, we've talked about circulation or bleeding. We spent a lot of time talking about that, and we're done with circulation. Are there any questions on that before we move on to airway?
Sue, I just wanted to mention one thing in case anyone's not clear. We are teaching you to use a pressure wrap in addition to wound packing because it allows you to maintain pressure and move on to other things. But you can also use a pressure wrap without wound packing just to secure and keep adding direct pressure to a regular wound, a wound that perhaps might not be as severe a wound as the examples we've given you tonight. So these are all techniques you can use, and so we want you to know that you can use them in different situations and in different ways.